I am going to do a brief introduction. I'm going to introduce each of the panelists separately as they speak. So it's me, then Adam is going to make some remarks about his book, and then we will go on to the two commentators. Do you have a preference about which of you go? Because we didn't actually talk about this. So we'll just go in the order that if it's all right, we'll just go like this, the way that you're seated. All right, that's great. Okay, not to bias the commentators, but I have to start by gushing a bit about this book, so to speak. We're all faced with the eternal puzzle of how the innumerable pieces of the world fit together. Most of us settle for a small part and give up on grasping the whole, alleging the unique complexity of life today, etc. A part of Adam Hanieh's achievement in Crude Capitalism is to show us a full set of the major elements that have created this thing that we call global capitalism. Remarkably diverse elements are marshaled and explained. Europe's 1920s scramble for the Middle East, the interwar history of Venezuela, Russian oil under Lenin before the Soviet era, and Russian oil under Putin after the Soviet era, the managerial revolution as accelerated in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Texas in 3 non-adjacent decades, the American post-war plunder of Germans' trade secrets and hiring of their post-war criminals, oil and anti-colonial struggles, the impact of thermoplastics on American power, the rise of national oil companies, the petroleum scramble for Africa, new ties between the Middle East and East Asia. It's not only all here, but it's all interconnected. This book is a heroic and sustained exercise of intellectual joinery and of integrative narration. And as one compulsively interdisciplinary person to another, you have really done it in this book. It's a masterwork of concise synthesis of the elemental forces of the modern world. Crude Capitalism is a great read for the same reason that Blade Runner is a great movie. It posits not only that the damage done by the system is very far along, and that order is imposed by an oligarchy of super major corporations, but also that the system constitutes every aspect of the life world from which we'd launch our efforts to change the system. So Adam focuses not only on oil as energy, but oil as petrochemicals, and asks us to see how oil revolutionized cheap mass production and consumption. Oil lives in the ubiquity of plastic as much as in aviation fuel. Oil is not only in the air we breathe, but in the food we eat and in nearly every tool, including the molecules of our information systems. This grasp of a kind of totality raises the bars for thought and action very, very high. Adam's final chapter is called Confronting the Climate Emergency, and he does by insisting that we will need a different system of production aimed at human needs, involving a decommodification of our social existence. These things are hard to imagine, and yet the book certainly inspired me to become much better at imagining them. They might look impossible 1 week after a US election that canceled the Green New Deal to ramp up drill, baby, drill. But on the other hand, we may be able to take advantage of apparent popular unhappiness with halfway measures. Adam's book shows us how powerful, ruthlessly determined, and wholly systemic thinking can be. This is the 35th launch of a book written by an ISRF fellow, and I mention this to remind us of our collective intellectual resources. The problem with the genre to which Blade Runner belongs is the focus on the lone hero. We can't save the world one replicant at a time. In contrast, Adam's book features oil's cast of thousands just in the upper echelons of the planning system. Institutions like universities and research foundations support a latent knowledge counter system. Our fellows here at ISRF work on social rights, race and finance, theories of economic equality, migration and sexuality, democratic economic planning, alternatives to green finance, etc. Our authors here exemplify the collective intelligence that means that if we really fight, we can build different societies. Our knowledge and people need to get much better organized, and Crude Capitalism is the history of how an imperial sector really did it. Okay, on to our speakers. Adam Hanieh will speak first and is Professor of Political Economy and Global Development at the Institute for Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. He is also Distinguished Research Fellow at the Institute of International and Area Studies in Tsinghua University, Beijing, China. As a leading scholar of Middle East political economy, Adam's research has particularly focused on the dynamics of class and state formation in the 6 oil-rich Gulf Arab monarchies, and on the profound impact that Gulf capitalism has had on socioeconomic and political developments in the wider Middle East. In addition to his work on the Gulf, Adam has written extensively on Palestine and was a founding member of the Center for Palestinian Studies at SOAS, the University of London. He is the author of 3 books on the Middle East, including Money, Markets, and Monarchies, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and the Political Economy of the Contemporary Middle East, which came out with Cambridge in 2018, and which was also awarded the 2019 British International Studies Association International Political Economy Group Book Prize. Alongside dozens of academic articles, his essays on contemporary politics have appeared in New Left Review, Jacobin, Socialist Register, Jadaliyya, Marip, the New York Review of Books, and Monthly Review. Adam, thanks for writing this great book, and thanks for being here to talk with us about it.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I want to begin by thanking everyone for being here in person and also online. I want to really thank ISRF for the Political Economy Fellowship. It's been a real honor to be holding that fellowship and also to meet so many great colleagues in this kind of cohort. And I really feel ISRF is something quite special in terms of how funding and support for research takes place. It's quite rare to see such an emphasis on building a camaraderie and a intellectual cohort around this kind of research. So I really do appreciate ISRF's support in this. And also, thank you very much to my colleagues Adrienne and Angus, 2 people whose work I really respect and have learnt a lot from. And I'm looking forward to talking more with both of them tonight. So I wanted to just give an overview, if you like, of some of the themes in the book and highlight a few things that I think are important, particularly for the contemporary moment, and then turn it over to I think Angus will speak first. So firstly, the aim of writing this book. There's a lot that's been written on oil and energy and climate and capitalism, and there's many histories of the oil commodity and in the oil industry. The motivation for me to undertake this project is partly to do with the work that Chris described on the Gulf and the oil economies and oil states of the Middle East. But the deeper problem, which I always felt in a lot of the writing about oil, is a kind of commodity determinism. What I mean by this is oil, which at the end of the day is just a black sticky goo, is kind of imbued with a lot of power. It's described as being the prize in the famous title of Daniel Jürgen's book, The Prize. It's described as a curse. It's described as, in the words of the Venezuelan oil minister, the devil's excrement. So all of these kinds of terms and ways that we think about oil give this commodity power. It makes it appear as though oil inherently has some kind of inherent power to it. What's wrong with this, in my opinion, is that it overlooks the way that oil as a commodity is actually embedded in capitalism, and what capitalism does to give, if you like, a meaning or a significance or this apparent power to oil as this commodity. So that's kind of the motivation, if you like, the background to where this book comes from. This is an approach. I don't at all claim to be the only person who takes this approach to oil. We can look at the wonderful work of people like Andreas Malm writing on coal and more recently oil. We can look at the work of Matt Huber in his book Lifeblood. We can look at Michael Watts, Hannah Appel. There are many scholars of oil who try to, if you like, decenter the commodity and place capitalism in the story much more fully. But what I've tried to do in this book is to think about this in ways that tells the history of oil, but also the diverse geographies in which oil is embedded. And I'll come back to this in a second. So the other thing that I've really attempted to do is to think about what oil becomes as it circulates. I feel that there is a tendency in a lot of writing on oil to focus on crude oil, the upstream reserves, the oil under the ground, and not to think so much about what oil becomes as it circulates, as it's refined, as it's processed. So that's the kind of emphasis that I've tried to put on in the book, is to think about the way the oil changes as it circulates through our lives, and the ways that is embedded in certain things, in particular things like finance, financial markets, currency, the American dollar, to think about the way it's embedded in food and agriculture, and the petrochemical industry, which I'm going to speak about a little bit more in a second. So basically to emphasize, if you like, what does oil become as it circulates? It's not just a liquid transport fuel, which is the way I think many of us tend to think about oil. So, having said that, I'm happy to explore some of these ideas in a lot more detail, but I do want to just quickly highlight 4 points or 4 themes that I think are important, particularly in today's world, but particularly given the fact that we are having this meeting at the time of COP29 in Azerbaijan, and I think a lot of the debates that are going on in COP at the moment bear directly to some of the comments that I want to make. So 4 points, or four kind of themes. The first of these is this question of petrochemicals and plastics. I feel that this is a theme that is really understudied in the writing on oil. Because of that tendency to think about oil solely as a liquid transport fuel. However, if we look around us in the room today, basically everything that surrounds us is a product of oil. Okay? The clothes that we wear, the synthetic fibers that we wear, the paints, the plastics, the artificial rubbers, all of these things that adorn the room, the seats, our clothes, our laptops, these are all products of oil. They are synthetic materials that ultimately derive from fossil fuels, in particular oil. And I think this turn to this synthetic world, which we can date quite precisely, it was the middle of the 20th century, is something that's become naturalized. It's something that we don't really think about. We look around us and we just assume this is the way the world is. And when we talk about plastics, we tend to talk about them in the sense of their toxicity, the microplastics and these kinds of problems, which are obviously big problems, but that language or that way of thinking about petrochemicals and plastics doesn't go far enough. Okay, it kind of obscures this link with the fossil fuel industry. So this shift in the mid-20th century is when we can date the replacement of natural products, natural rubbers, natural fertilizers, things like wood and glass and so forth, with synthetic products of hydrocarbons. And this is I think it's quite a fascinating story, the way this took place. It connects a lot to World War II and the immediate aftermath of World War II, which I don't really have time to speak to. But the fundamental point here is that oil, because of this synthetic revolution, became not simply a fuel. The byproducts of oil refining came to underlie all of our material production. And what this did was it, one, invisibilized oil in the way that I've said. It's all around us, yet we don't see it. And secondly, it really cemented the power of the big fossil fuel companies, the big oil companies, in particular the big American oil companies who led this process, led this transition. So one of the things I try to do in the book is describe the history of this process, the kind of industry structures, the debates that happen, the aftermath of World War II in Europe, Western Europe, where this transition from coal to oil took place, and petrochemicals was a really key feature of this. And then look a little bit later at what this did for capitalism. This synthetization of our world that is around us. Really trying to make the argument that we need to reframe the question of plastics and petrochemicals as a problem of oil and problem of fossil fuels, not simply a problem of recycling and toxic waste. It's worth noting that the oil industry itself sees petrochemicals as being the largest sector of demand growth for oil over the next 3 decades. They speak very openly that this is the future of oil in that kind of language. So breaking with our fossil fuel-centered world is not going to happen unless we think about different ways of material production, and in particular think about what petrochemicals and plastics actually do for capitalism. So that's the first point that I wanted to make. I'm very happy to talk more about this in the time that we have for discussion. The second point, again, Chris alluded to this, is the kinds of diverse geographies that we are seeing emerge within the oil industry. In particular, the role of national oil companies, or NOCs. So these are state-owned oil companies that are dominantly located in the Gulf region of the Middle East, as well as China and East Asia. There's been a shift in how the world oil industry is structured. If we go back to the early 20th century, it was mostly dominated by the famous Seven Sisters, the big 7 Western oil companies that basically controlled all of oil, from the upstream production through refining, through the marketing of oil, through the shipping of oil, through most of the 20th century. However, today, the largest oil firms are these national oil companies. And in particular, we have to highlight here Saudi Aramco, a state-owned oil company based in Saudi Arabia. It used to be an American firm, but after nationalization in the 80s, it is now fully Saudi-owned. Saudi Aramco is by far the biggest oil company in the world. Its profits last year were $153 billion US, which exceeds the collective profits of the 5 largest Western firms: ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, BP, and Total Energies. So those are the firms we tend to think about. They're massive, important firms, but add together all of their profits, Aramco's profits exceeded that collective figure. Importantly, these national oil companies like Saudi Aramco have diversified down the oil value chain. So they are no longer just producers of crude oil. They are also dominating the refining sector. They own shipping companies, tankers that moves oil around the world. And they also own the petrochemical, some of the biggest petrochemical firms and plastics firms in the world, fertilizers and other kinds of products as well. So they are vertically integrated, highly diversified companies that are not simply crude oil producers. So I just very quickly, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I just wanted to show a few, I think, important features about this, and in particular highlight something that I talk about in the book as the East-East hydrocarbon circuit. What I'm talking here about is the rise, dramatic rise in China's oil consumption over the last 20 years, associated with the rise of China as a center of global manufacturing. We can see in 2000, China consumed about 4% of the world's oil imports. Today, it's 20%. 1/5 of the world's oil imports go to China, which is a remarkable figure. It's a remarkable figure, and it is associated with a huge increase in the demand for oil globally. So this is a very important trend, and one of the consequences of this is that the Middle East's oil exports have shifted eastwards. Okay, they've moved from being exported to Europe or to the United States towards primarily going to China and wider East Asia. So we can also see associated with this, the rise in refining capacity in the Middle East and China, East Asia. About a quarter or more than a quarter of the world's refining capacity is now in these regions. Not so much in the United States or Europe. That share has fallen, and very soon the Middle East, if not already, will have overtaken Europe in terms of refining capacity. So again, this is not simply the export of crude oil, it's also the export of refined products that we see. And very importantly, as I said, the exports of basic plastics. So the share of imports from GCC, GCC is the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates and so forth. You can see they are major exporters of the most important plastics, basic plastics, polymers of ethylene and polymers of propylene. And why is this important? These are refined products that go to China and East Asian manufacturing circuits. They get they're into all of the materials that we have all around us, and then get exported out. So these kinds of internet connections are really important to think about, because what they do is they embed oil even more centrally in our daily lives. They also mean that these NOCs have a very important connection to or influence on climate policy making. We can see this very clearly today in COP29. Azerbaijan, of course, is a major oil-producing state. 90% of its exports are hydrocarbon-related. Last year, COP28 in Dubai, chaired by the president of one of these national oil companies, the Abu Dhabi National Oil Companies. So what we see here is direct seat at the table, a direct influence on the process of climate policy making. It's different from the ExxonMobils and the Chevrons of this world, who, despite their massive lobbying powers, despite their massive influence, they are not directly at the table where policies are being developed. And I think this is a really, really important thing to kind of bring out, because it, number one, illustrates the bankruptcy of some of the COP process, but two, it really embeds oil companies in this in the policy-making world in very insidious ways, which, again, I'm happy to speak about more in discussion. Okay, moving along, the issue, the third point that I wanted to make is connected to some of the kind of broader politics of oil, in particular the importance that the Middle East region has to American global power. This is been the case since after the Second World War, and I do think this is really important to think about at this current moment because of the war in Gaza. We can, I think, really understand the motivations of the United States, complete backing of Israel, the funding of the war machine, the arming of Israel, and the political legitimation of Israel through placing the Middle East region or through placing the war in Gaza in the context of the wider Middle East, okay, and the centrality of the region to American power because of its enormous oil reserves. So I want to again. I finished this book before October, so I couldn't deal with these in depth. But I do think thinking about U.S. support and culpability in the genocide only makes sense through thinking about the region's absolute centrality to world oil. The final point, and I'll wrap it up here, is just some of the kind of political implications of the argument, and I go through in the final chapter of the book some of the problems with the way that the green transition is generally portrayed, and the kinds of solutions that are put forward, things such as electric vehicles, biofuels, hydrogen, the hydrogen question of hydrogen, green hydrogen and blue hydrogen, and the concept of net zero. I think looking at these so-called solutions, it's very clear that they are inadequate and false solutions, and they are being heavily promoted by the oil industry, including the national oil companies. So I think we need to confront this question head on and realize that the idea of the green transition is in many ways a myth. There is no green transition taking place. If we look historically at energy transitions, for example, the coal to oil transition that took place in the middle of the 20th century, these transitions, or so-called transitions, do not involve the replacement of one energy source by another, but the addition of more energy. And that is precisely what we're seeing today. We're certainly seeing in some parts of the world the rollout of solar and wind, and other kinds of energy technologies. But this is added upon fossil fuels. Okay, so last year, for example, was the world's largest production of coal consumption in history. Okay, the same with oil, the same with gas. Okay, the share of coal may have dropped dramatically over the 20th and 21st centuries, but the absolute production of these fossil fuels has increased. And this, I think, is really, really important to center because it shows that what matters is absolute production, not relative share. And I think that's clear. Clearly on display in terms of the debates at COP29. The reasons for this, I think, have to do with, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, the way that energy is consumed and produced under capitalism. The fact that we tend towards the ever-increasing throughput of energy that draws all of these diverse forms of energy production into our lives. We can see this most clearly, I guess, today with the questions of AI and data centers and the massive demands for energy and other resources that come through these technologies. Okay, I'll leave it there. I don't want to go on too long. And thank you again to the ISRF and Chris and all of you for being here today.
Well, we're going to turn to our commentators now, and the first is Angus McNelly. He is a lecturer in international development at King's College London. His first book, which is just out last year, I think, is called Now We Are in Power, The Politics of Passive Revolution in 21st Century Bolivia. His work contributes to the international scholarly debates on energy transitions, climate change mitigation, and the politics of development in 21st century Latin America. He works on novel methodological approaches to studying the green transition, linking the City of London to extractive and financial frontiers in the global south, for example. He adds to ongoing attempts to decolonize energy transitions by interrogating how green extractivism and global finance shape the transition from fossil fuels to the green economy. He also studies natural resource-led development and the politics of development in Latin America.
So I've been following Adam's work for a number of years now, and I really enjoyed his previous book, Money, Monarchs, and Markets, about the political economy of the Middle East. His work on petrochemicals I found fascinating, world money, but I couldn't kind of fit it together until I found myself in a East London branch of Lidl, which is a UK supermarket, doing my shopping and listening to the Edward Said Memorial Lecture that Adam gave last year. And this was the first time that this intellectual project on oil came into view with kind of some clarity. And Adam highlighted in that lecture a number of key contributions about the way that we should rethink oil. So the significance of oil as an input into all production processes, as a material input, not just fuel. Okay, I was in a supermarket buying food which was essentially oil, covered in oil, surrounded by oil. And this kind of realization did not make me want to buy anything from the supermarket. He also was making that lecture at a time where people were very angry, post-pandemic, in the cost of living crisis, about the profits of the Western oil companies. And I think kind of the 5 Western super majors have each posted profits of over 20 billion for 2022. And Adam was kind of one of the first people I heard to really say, hang on a minute, Aramco has just posted the biggest profits ever of any corporation on record at 161 billion for 2022. And then highlighting kind of the role of the East Corporation, the rise from China, and the fact that the Chinese were starting to buy oil from Saudi Arabia in RMB. And I think that the importance of these insights wasn't just a way to rethink the oil industry, but a way to rethink environmental politics and what we should do about oil. Okay, all of a sudden, the focus on oil majors looks really misplaced. Okay, as Adam says, the biggest oil companies of the world are national oil companies, and they don't just lobby governments, they are governments and have the seat at the table when it comes to global climate negotiations, right? And I think it's almost apt that the latest iteration of COP, which is going on at the moment, is taking place at one of the sites, one of the forgotten sites of oil that is uncovered by Adam in the book, Baku in Azerbaijan. He also shines light on how EVs and the future promised to us by people like Elon Musk is extremely limited and actually won't save us. In fact, in the last chapter of the book, he shows precisely the opposite of the case, and that electric vehicles might have larger emissions than we initially thought, and then kind of more conventional combustion engines. Okay, and this leads to kind of like quite worrying political implications, but I think it's a really, really important contribution in terms of how we should think about the climate crisis, how we should think about the place of oil within society today, and what we should do about it. So I think one of the major achievements, or the major achievement of the book, is pulling together these different threads that I found very disparate when I started to read Adam's work into a coherent arc that makes us rethink the history of 20th and 21st capitalism through the prism of oil. Okay? And it is, as Adam says, a world history. When I was starting to think about what I was going to say here as a Latin Americanist, I was going to say, well, at least if I have nothing else to say, I can say, what about Latin America? But there are whole sections on Venezuela and the place of the Caribbean in the restructuring of the oil industry in the 20th century, so I couldn't even do that. And this speaks to the kind of real intellectual and geographical scope of the book. So as Adam has said, Crude Capitalism is a very theoretically sophisticated book, focusing on what oil does for capitalism. So Adam focuses on how oil enables a tendency towards endless accumulation outside of natural limits, a space-time compression and the emergence of a truly global capitalism, a speed up of turnover times, and a rising organic composition of capital, i.e. the displacement of labor by machines within production processes that enables a massive concentration of wealth and wealth inequality that we're seeing in the 21st century. But rather than getting bogged down in these theoretical discussions about the different functions of oil within capitalism, Adam uses these as kind of threads to guide us through world history over this period, wearing his theory very, very lightly. And he takes us through 2 world wars, the Russian Revolution, fascism, the end of European empires, post-colonial state and nation building, the neoliberal counter-revolution, the end of the Soviet bloc, and the climate crisis that we confront today. I mean, it's quite a journey. And I think this is an incredible achievement. It's one of these books where, as I was reading it, as someone who is an academic and likes to think, I could write a book like that. This is definitely not a book that I think I could write at the moment at least. And I think that it's something that I will aspire to, because I think it's a fantastic example of how you can be theoretically sophisticated, but write a book that is accessible and that everybody should read, whether they are an academic, whether they are interested in theory or not. Having said that, I do have some questions and comments that come from the analysis, more to kind of take the conversation on, as it were. So, for all of the focus on what oil does for capitalism, which is completely understandable given the geological determinism and the way in which oil has been framed as a prize, as a curse, as the devil's excrement. But I want to hear more about its afterlives. So what happens after oil has been transformed from a commodity form into CO2, into oil spills, into microplastics in the sea, earth, seemingly everywhere, right? It's not the focus of the book, but I do think focusing on oil's afterlives tells us maybe different and contradictory stories to the one that Adam tells us about the functioning of oil as a commodity within capitalism. So what happens if we focus on the negative ecologies of what happens to CO2, say, after it is oil and it escapes the commodity form, and what happens to attempts to commodify negative ecologies, right, and how this has failed in the production of carbon markets, and so on and so forth. And I think that this could add another side to the debate around oil that maybe will add to the richness of our understanding about what to do about climate change. And this leads me on to my second set of questions about post-oil futures. Okay, so the final 2 pages left us with a tantalizing vision of what comes next. Okay, an eco-socialist future. But I really want to kind of push you about the politics that comes out of understanding contemporary capitalism through the lens of oil and what it means for the climate crisis. At the moment, oil is so deeply imbricated within the function of capitalism, it's impossible to see a pathway without getting rid of capitalism. But my question is kind of, how do we do this? And what type of institutions are needed? I think one of the really powerful things that I found about the book was the ways in which Adam showed that with the development of global capitalism, with the kind of like diachronism that you get with crises and resolutions to crises, world wars, new corporate forms emerge within the oil industry. So the early trusts are a way to consolidate companies across state boundaries, allowing Standard Oil to control circulation of oil, transport and refining processes across the United States. The Seven Sisters are kind of straddling the two sides of the bifurcated world market in the interwar period, with one foot in the US market, one foot in Europe and the Middle East, which allows them to consolidate their position as the world leaders within this sector. Adam then shows us under neoliberalism how privatization on the stock market sets the stage for the globalization of equity markets, encourages firms to separate their upstream and downstream operations to encourage competitiveness, and offers firm increased finances, leading to increased mergers and acquisitions and the rise of the Western supermajors. So my question is, what are the institutional forms that enable an eco-socialist transition? Right? Often this debate is framed in really simplistic dichotomies, state versus private, multinational corporation versus local. We need to reorganize the energy system, and we need to reorganize society more generally. But I wondered what type of institutions outside of the corporate form are needed in order for us to do that, given that you paint such a beautifully rich picture about the different types of organization that emerge at different moments of history. And how do we build them? Which leads me to my final point. So as much as I'm completely behind the focus on critiquing the fetishization of oil, right, as something that's magical, there is an effective power about oil that captured the imaginations of political movements across the spectrum, particularly in this post-World War II period, right? The kind of like post-colonial moment where everybody, seemingly from North Africa to the Middle East to Latin America, was thinking about building different types of nations and reorganizing the world order, and oil was central to that. And it wasn't just oil as a commodity, it's the promise of futurity and different, kind of more importantly, a different futurity that oil offered, right? And this is kind of what Fernando Coronel meant by kind of like the magical state, this ability to promise something. And it seems to me, if we want an eco-socialist future, we've been very bad at promising stuff. I mean, degrowth's promise seems to be consume less, which as a political promise isn't going to mobilize many people. So how do we replace the futurity offered by oil by something else? And I know that there's problems with this promise, right? But we have to acknowledge that oil has managed to mobilize many people, right? And so if we're building these institutions that get us to an alternative system, what are the types of horizons of political futures that we need to think about as well that will lead us out of the world built by oil? So thank you very much to the ISRF and Adam for writing this book, and for everybody listening to me this evening.
Thanks, Angus. Those are essential questions, and I'm really glad that you're going to get Adam to answer them. Our second commentator, before we open it up for questions, is Adrienne Buller. She is a London researcher and writer whose work has appeared in The New Statesman, The Guardian, the FT, Bloomberg, Phenomenal World, and elsewhere. The former director of research at Commonwealth. She is now a fellow there and also founder and director of a partner project, The Breakdown, which publishes essays, interviews, climate resources, and also now hosts a podcast. She is the author of many essays, including Why Asset Managers Aren't Solving the Climate Crisis, The Limits of Privatized Climate Policy, What's Really Behind the Failure of Green Capitalism, We Can Reimagine Our Systems of Ownership and Control, and the especially timely Sleepwalking into the Storm. She is co-author of the book Owning the Future, which came out with Verso in 2022, and also of The Value of a Whale, out that same year with Manchester. I actually am, this is another book that I really admire. One of the great things about it is it takes kind of the PR, the curtain of what we are told, goes behind it through extensive research and shows us what is actually there. So for example, TotalEnergies says that it's only doing sustainability bonds. What does that actually mean? Adrienne says BlackRock's monopoly on predictive risk analysis, what's really involved with that? So I really appreciate you not only for being here to talk about Adam's book, but also for the extensive work that went into writing this really excellent piece of work, which I hope people also read. Adrienne, over to you.
Appreciate it. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be speaking about Adam's book. I had the pleasure of interviewing Adam twice, actually, earlier this year for the aforementioned podcast. And in both instances, whether we were speaking about the contents of the book that we're here to discuss tonight, or a sort of special episode on, as he touched upon, the centrality of oil to the politics surrounding the onslaught on Gaza and the sort of special relationship between the United States and the legitimation of the regime in Israel, I learned so much and found at every point that, a question that I asked, thinking that I knew in advance what the answer would be, I was sort of taken aback by a new depth of knowledge and expertise and insight at every turn. And I think that speaks to Adam in general. He's an incredibly generous academic, both in his intellect and in his time, and I can't recommend this book enough. And I think, at the time, speaking back in March when we did, it felt incredibly timely then, and now, in the midst of a COP, as we've already spoken about, being hosted by a petrostate, and in the wake of an election in the United States in which, in his previous term, President Trump brought many oil executives immediately into the helm of senior roles in his cabinet, not least Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil. We're looking at another era in which oil has incredible influence over politics, though it's worth saying as well that President Biden also signed many more oil and gas licenses in his first years as president than Trump, so oil's influence, I suppose, extends across the political spectrum. We're also coming to this conversation on the heels of 12 months in which the world has, on average, sat at just over 1.6 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial warming, meaning that we have sort of blown right by, at least temporarily, the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold set out in the Paris Agreement. And in many ways, that should come as shock and awe. This is a sort of international agreement that's meant to set the entire ambition for how the world addresses the climate crisis. And yet it's come with relatively little fanfare. And a big part of the reason for that is, in a way, this has always been part of the plan. We've now entered the era of sort of overshoot of the 1.5 degree target, which is baked into the climate scenarios and the models that have informed policymakers for the past several decades since the beginning of climate negotiations. And the scenario that most informed the 1.5 degree target when it was being lobbied for in the negotiations around Paris came from a Dutch team called Image. And in their scenario, they sort of solidified this idea of overshoot, which is that we can and should blow past 1.5 degrees, and at some point in the future, using some kind of combination of carbon removal technologies and possibly geoengineering, sort of draw down sufficient carbon that we can bring ourselves back under the threshold. Now, it's a team of scientific researchers. They weren't taking what was a purposefully ideological position, at least I'm going to assume as much. However, in their scenario, the assumption was embedded that we would have as little disruption to our existing economic model as possible, and critically, that any early retirement of fossil fuel assets would cause profound economic disruption to the degree that it should be avoided to any extent possible. Now, how did such a kind of assumption get baked into the kind of influential models that ostensibly are apolitical and which inform climate policy? In large part, you could point the finger at an incredibly effective kind of lobbying regimen undertaken by the fossil fuel industry, and certainly they are highly effective at that. But I think that, what we're talking about in terms of the influence of oil on climate policy is so much deeper than that, and that's exactly what Adam unpacks in this book. It's not just that we have a handful of sort of bad actors at the helm of a few American oil companies with great lobbying facilities. That's definitely the case. But instead, what Adam's work so brilliantly points out to all of us is that oil is in every aspect of our lives, the clothes we wear, the food we eat, the way we design our cities around the motor car. London has 50 square kilometers dedicated to parking within one of the world's most populous cities. And all of these things have been mutually constituted over the history of contemporary capitalism. Oil cannot be understood without the nature of capitalism, and capitalism, likewise, in the form that we now recognize it, cannot be understood without the development of the oil economy. And this is the case, I think, that Adam's work makes so brilliantly, and which I think, on the one hand, it may sound self-evident, and at the same time, it's a book that, in the way that it presents and researches these arguments, is completely novel, something that I think is difficult to do for a topic so well-trod as oil. At the end of the book, Adam makes the excellent kind of argument that the reason that the green transition that we've been so long promised is not happening is that what it sets out to do is to undertake one-to-one replacements for the technologies that we currently have that rely on fossil fuels, whether that's the cars we drive or energy systems, even plastics, and to find sort of sustainable solutions to replace these. But the case that he makes, I think very convincingly, is that due to the inextricable relationship between the structure of the oil economy and the functioning of capitalism itself, there is no simple one-to-one replacement. And the case that you make at the end, and I think the question that the book raises, is that if oil as an industry must end in its current form, if we need to stop extracting oil, as the International Energy Agency has sort of unequivocally made clear in terms of new exploration, does that spell inevitably the end of capitalism as we know it? A question that I would pose to you now, which is sort of hinted at, but which I'd love to hear you make the strong case for here. And the second question that the book raises, I think, at the end, in its pointing towards eco-socialism as a sort of inevitable solution, I kind of hate that word, but an inevitable path forward out of the mess that we're in, is that a common eco-socialist approach to this problem would be to say that what we need is more democratic control, likely mediated through the vehicle of the state over key industries, not least fossil fuels. You often hear a rallying cry for a publicly directed, democratically directed ownership and wind down of this industry. But as the book rightly points out, many of the firms that are most critical and at the cutting edge, the leading edge of the climate crisis and of oil production are already state-owned, albeit not particularly democratically in most cases. So the question that I have to you is a strategic one, which is, what is the answer from an eco-socialist perspective to the wind down of the fossil fuel industry? If that vehicle is the state, how do you see that mediated? And how does that look at an international and global perspective when many of the world's top petrostates currently are sort of without the reach of any kind of sort of democratic control? And with that, I will hand over to Adam and just say thank you again for writing this brilliant history of oil. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you to both Angus and Adrienne. And to echo the comments that Chris made, Adrienne's book is really fantastic, and you should definitely read it. It's also lovely, written in a very lovely style, I find. Okay, I don't want to take up too much time, but just to reply to some of the points, and maybe beginning with this question of the politics or where to go. I think really, this is not just a question of climate, but grounding our politics in movements, I think, is really important. Social movements is, rather than thinking about it as simply a change of policy at the level of the state. I think historically we know that only real change happens on the back of movements that mobilize people, that try to build, not always with success, but over historical time, can make grounds. We know this in terms of all sorts of other social struggles. So I think that's the place I would start. It does mean eventually challenging the state, I think, and taking state power in sorts. The problem, though, I think, with the way that this kind of policy-focused direction, what that tends to do within capitalist states is it allows oil companies, fossil fuel companies, and all the associated industries to actually grab the benefits of this. And that's exactly what we see in the United States, for example, with Biden's the Green New Deal and also the Inflation Reduction Act. The investments, and we're talking billions of dollars here, have gone into things like carbon capture, which is another one of these completely bogus solutions, and in fact is extremely dangerous because actually what it tends to be used for is enhanced oil recovery, more oil production. 80% of carbon capture today is devoted to actually producing more oil. And the benefits that are of these billions of dollars in funds that are flowing through this ostensibly green policy in the US is going primarily to the big oil companies, ExxonMobil, Shell, and so forth. They are the ones who are capturing these funds. There's all sorts of ways I think we need to think about that. I think another aspect, which I didn't really speak about in the book, but I do, and Adrienne has worked on this, and I think it really is a crucial kind of area to highlight as a very dangerous development in climate policies is the question of carbon offset markets, which are very big in the Latin American context, but also in the African continent. These are basically schemes where companies will or entities will fund most often forest preservation schemes, and in return monetize the supposed emissions reduction as carbon credits that can be bought by polluters to kind of offset their production. The problem with this is, number one, the calculation of how much a forest protection scheme is worth is beset with all of these methodological problems, which Adrienne talks about in her book. And perhaps even the bigger problem is that when forests, it takes hundreds of years for a forest to kind of capture the carbon emissions that are supposedly swapped out for carbon credits. And if the forest burns down in that 100 years or whatever, that carbon has literally gone up in smoke. Now, this is a big problem because this is clearly a strategy of major polluters to kind of continue business as usual. And in the Gulf, Aramco, if you look at Aramco's carbon or mitigation strategy, 50% of the carbon it claims to mitigate by the year 2030 is made up by carbon offsets, mostly in Africa. So there's these kind of new forms of kind of green colonialism emerging in Africa as well. So I think this is, and we can see this really on display in the COP29. The agreement on this was made, I think, yesterday or the day before at COP. So that's an area I think we have to keep a big focus on. Just the final. I mean, maybe I don't want to go into the. I mean, maybe I want to give some space for questions from the floor. So I want to come back to the question of degrowth maybe a bit later, because it is an important one. But I just want to say that I think many of the scenarios that we kind of think are far off are actually appearing in the here and now. We can see this in the case of Valencia, for example, in the last few weeks. So these kinds of collapse scenarios are beginning to emerge globally. And I do think that this is a moment in which the question of the climate needs to be really put front and center in all of our politics, not simply the far-off speculation of climate change by 2100. it's got to do with how we organize our cities, how we organize our forms of food production, dealing with the effects of these kind of collapse scenarios, I think, inevitably raise questions of social justice and social movements. I think centering the question of the climate much more visibly is really important, not keeping it as a separate kind of climate issue, if you like, but actually centering all of our politics around the issue of the climate. I'll